Signs of the Southland for Wednesday, June 26th, 2024. Welcome to a history edition of Georgia Tech and Numbers and Words. My name is Akshay Ishwaran. Joining me today are Georgia Tech employee and history novice, if you can say that, Jack Purdy, and
That's kind
Grandmaster
of
history
mean.
expert, Mr.
That's out. It's accurate. It's accurate. It's
Grant.
accurate.
Gentlemen, how are we doing? It's a weird one today because it's a Wednesday. It's not a Monday night at like 9 o'clock. What are we doing? What
Like
are we up to here?
the Wednesdays we record are either when there's emergency hirings or firings, or emergency national championships. But it seems to be when we record on a Wednesday. So this is the exact opposite pace of the usual franticness that we're required to do on a Wednesday recording.
Yeah,
I mean,
I was just thinking it doesn't feel like a Wednesday. I mean, I wound up on doing my Tuesday thing on a Monday. I wound up doing my Monday thing on a Wednesday. This is a very strange week for me. I'll tell you that.
There are no rules in the summer.
Nope.
I mean, look, there are what, 4 days left in the athletic calendar.
The
It
next time we
is.
record, the SEC will be new.
The ACC will be new too.
Yeah.
This brings up a perfect time for me to bring up the Directors Cup standings if I can find the latest edition of them.
Yes. I think
Oh
I
no,
saw
this
the
is the
ACC
latest
posted.
fall edition, and
I
I
saw the
should have
ACC
been.
posted something about this. Like they had
Come
I
on.
think the ACC had six in the top 25.
Yes. The SEC actually had seven, it turns out. So just beat the ACC by a hair. But
Nice.
as I continue to stall and try to get this document to load, because it's for some reason on this dumbest website and embedded in a very dumb way that annoys me very deeply. Georgia Tech is around Villanova and Grand Canyon. Now, with those two things being stated, what rank
Okay.
do you think Georgia Tech is in the final Directors Cup standing?
Well, here's the problem. I just pulled it up, so I'll let Jake be the guinea pig here for guessing.
Give me the first one you said again. I completely blanked and my brain went right to the second one.
Villanova, the three in order. Actually, I'll give you five in order. How about that?
Okay.
Yale, Villanova, Georgia Tech, Grand Canyon, and Air Force.
Well, Air
Those are
Force is really
the
good. Air Force has some standout postseason results. I do know that. Yale, I mean, between lacrosse, I think hockey may have been in the mix there. Villanova, they're not your Power Five schools, but they're not scrubs either. All of them have at least one or two really, really solid programs. I'm gonna guess we're right around 70, no, 81. 81.
Oh, I should have gone with your
close.
first guess.
Yeah, you should have gone with your first because Tech is 74th. Uh,
Dang, I was literally about to say that, but then I was like, that's like
Also,
higher
so
than
much
we've
for
been in a
Air
long
Force having
time.
good sports, by the way, because they did not score a single point in the spring portion of this ranking set. So, woof.
I
But
didn't say
that
they had
is
good
your latest.
baseball.
That is your latest Directors Cup standings update. That is the end of the athletic calendar with baseball's tournament being done. So the next time like the guy said, the next time you see this podcast, it'll be the Cal and Stanford ACC era with special guest SMU, which is fantastic for everyone involved, surely. Some other news. This is extremely hyper relevant, I guess, if you are listening to this exactly on Thursday, June 27th, when this should come out. It is a mess traffic wise in the city of Atlanta. There is a presidential debate going on across the street from McCamish Pavilion. McCamish Pavilion is being used as a staging media area for that debate, and 10th Street is closed from Spring to State Street. So basically, avoid campus entirely because traffic is going to be a mess.
It's not
I
only
would
that.
also,
There's the
I
largest swim meet in the country, basically independent swim meet in the country, the Atlanta Summer League Championships with uh, hundreds of kids and even another hundreds of parents. at the pool going in and out for 3 straight days. Today was day one, but there's 2 more days of it left.
So avoid campus at all costs, but also avoid downtown and specifically the stadium district because Copa America will be visiting Mercedes-Benz Stadium. That'll be the U.S. versus Panama. It should be a relatively packed house, despite some of Jack's tweets about that
I'm just
earlier
reporting
today.
facts. I'm just reporting facts that Ticketmaster has given me.
Woo! I'm
Anyways,
feeling the tension over
also,
here. Just take
also,
the train tomorrow. That's
yeah,
my
yeah,
piece.
well, also
That's my
that.
piece every day.
No, I was going
But
to mention that because the Secret Service is shutting down part of the connector next to Tech, so it's basically
oh,
not
that'll
going to
be
be.
fun.
Yeah, so like driving anywhere close to Tech is effectively a terrible. I mean, yes, it's objectively a bad idea, but some people may have no
Have
other
we
option.
just considered, Jake, we looked at this photo a while ago where someone just released a bunch of water into the connector and turned it into a canal. Have we considered doing this? Has someone thought of this? I would love to
You,
be a waterside city.
amusingly, the image you're talking about's been going around since I'd say earlier this year, certainly before the water main broke, but that's definitely
Yeah,
what launched it into the stratosphere. But I'm a sucker for a good city on a river. I wouldn't complain here. The real question is how do you keep it within the connector once you get to about Freedom Parkway? Because it's not a ditch the whole way. No, no,
no, it's
no.
not.
You go down by Turner Field, you go to Sweet Auburn, it's on a bridge. So
We'll just
You
ask
it's a
put
the
bit
you
of a
put
nightmare.
locks,
let's get
put
that
damn locks in
let's
there.
get the acrylic that the aquarium uses to keep the tank in its place, and then
Yes.
just miles of that, just miles of that acrylic.
The highway is sloshing around on the former sound barriers, which are now acrylic walls keeping the
Yes,
water in.
yes,
Nice. It's basically an aqueduct at that point, but
right.
I digress.
We've had worse ideas. We attempted to put a soccer field on the connector at one point on this
That
podcast.
that was
So
that ended up being our favorite option out of that podcast.
it was the most workable option in that set. It's a really weird
Yeah.
point where we came on that one.
Just one more field, bro. One more field. That'll do it. That's all we need. One more field.
Speaking of fields, let's talk about digital ones. EA Sports' College Football 25 released a new Sights and Sound deep dive earlier today and had a couple of nice shots of what Georgia Tech's sights and sounds will look like when the game ships on July 19th. Buzz, obviously, in the game. The wreck, which I actually was a little worried about in the game in all of its
Hmm.
glory, and the full ride out is in there. The band and the pregame routine for Tech also in the game. However, interestingly enough, we did see that the band was not in its traditional white uniforms. It was in what looked to be gray or navy uniforms, which led, I think, a couple of us, well, one to worry and criticize EA for not getting their accuracy right, but two, to think that the that was an alternate uniform game and the alternate uniforms extended to the fans in the stands and the band and and the cheerleaders and everything like that. So interesting levels of technological complexity on this game, which I'm going to spin that as a good thing.
I wonder. Yeah, I also wonder how much of it is what Tech sent them as well, because a lot of assets like that would have been on the colleges to send to be like, hey, this is how it needs to be or how we want it to be. And so if you didn't send something to EA, you kind of just left it up in their hands. And with how many various things they had to get right, there, some things probably definitely were not priority one, which I think our band uniforms probably would have not been a priority one situation. But getting the rec right, I mean, also the end zones were blue in in those shots we saw, and so I really do wonder if there's like just a blue setting that exists for our games,
It's just a checkbox that
and it
says
just
use the uniforms that irritate this podcast the most.
and it just colors everything else blue for that particular game. I don't know, but we'll see.
To be fair, they have said that they'll use that they have like a full set of uniforms for every single team, so at least four,
Yeah,
and obviously however many combinations that come with those. So my guess is that we will see an alternate uniform game where that primary uniform color trumps the designs for everything else. That's typically how things work when it comes to FIFA and everything.
Mhm.
So we'll see. We'll see. It's only 3 weeks away. Some ratings came out too from one of the screenshots. If I can find it again, if you're interested in very influx, not finalized ratings for Tech and Florida State. Tech's a 77 overall team with a 75th or 75 offense and a 72 rated defense. Florida State 84, 82, and 80 in those three ratings respectively. So keep, I guess, keep an eye out on that. Those are, I think, what they've stated is all of that stuff will be updated every week. So as teams, it'll be just like if you played FIFA, if you played Madden, all of that stuff will be in flux, and updated as up to date as possible,
Mhm.
every week that the game is live. So, keep that all in mind. Gentlemen, the Olympics are coming up soon, and Georgia Tech has at least one, American representative heading to Paris. Chris Eubanks will be on the Olympic men's tennis team as the 44th ranked American or 44th ranked player in the world, and one of the top ranked Americans in the world. We almost had two Tech athletes in the U.S. Olympic team. Max Fowler made the final in the 3 meter dive at the Olympic trials in Knoxville, but did not advance to make the full squad, but gave it a good run. It was fun to see him compete at that. What's basically, I mean, the swim and dive trials, one of the most competitive athletic tournaments outside of Olympic competition. So, really, really good performance there. Other news in terms of tech and athletic related things. Drew Burress was named to Baseball America's All American team. He is the first freshman hitter on there since Clemson's Seth Beer back in 2016. The Atlanta Open included invited Andres Martin as a wild card bid again this year. This is actually, as we found out earlier today, the last iteration of the Atlanta Open. The organizers, the powers that be, have decided to not continue that particular tournament, which kind of stinks. It's a nice little tournament. It's a nice to see them, as much as we don't like the school out east, it's like nice to see them respect it, like giving the schools that are around the
Mhm.
area like a local flair, and like a hometown setting to
Yep.
participate in. Like they bring the cheerleaders, they bring the rec, like all of the pomp and circumstance of that. So we'll miss it. I think it's a fun little tournament. The last news item before we get into our featured content of the
I
day.
did have one piece there on the Atlanta Open. Think about how Atlantic Station is changing. I mean, there's really not many lots left to host it. So I'm sure they were put
Yeah.
in kind of an interesting spot there. I did want to highlight that. It's not just oh, it's going away and these are abandoned. It's, oh man, they've filled in all the courts almost at this point. So if you want to get out there, this is your chance to do that.
Yeah, it'll be a pretty competitive field. I don't know exactly when it is. I don't have that
Late
date
July.
memorized.
Late
Late
July.
July.
Like the last Tuesday, Wednesday, or second last Tuesday, Wednesday, like whatever the week before the 30, like the 24th basically is when stuff really gets rolling. Venus
Right.
Williams is playing an exhibition match. Andy Roddick is playing an exhibition match. They usually pull a couple legends out for this kind of thing. So, um, Venus is still actively playing, but not in competitively, but it's not like at a high level anymore or anything like that. So it's a good time to see her. I think she's playing Sloane Stevens. And then there's a couple other actually legit players like Ben Sheldon's playing.
Hmm.
So it's going to be like they did not say Chris was playing, which he's not because that is the week before the Olympics and during the Olympics. So he has a little double booked there. Otherwise, he
He's
probably would
I
be
definitely
playing.
going
mean,
to want to be on the right surface for the lead up to the Olympics. I mean,
Also, that
that's
yeah,
it's
it's going to be on
very much a
clay.
hard court tournament. So
Yeah,
the 24th is 2 days before the opening ceremony. So,
yeah. He won't
yeah,
be here.
you might want to already be in Paris.
Yeah.
Just a thought. Just last news and note before we head on to our featured content of the day. The President's Tour of Georgia has started. I think it's basically halfway over, but they're in Rome today,
Yep.
along with the Rec. This is basically the Rec Summer Tour as well. Apparently, President Cabrera and his wife stopped at a Buc-ee's and posed with the Buc-ee's mascot and
The whole video,
Buzz.
man. They put a whole video out. Yeah, they did a whole thing. The
That is a
Calhoun
lot of
Bucky.
that's a lot more production quality than I expected.
Yeah, the Calhoun Bucky's is becoming a very frequent stop for a lot of Georgians. I'm discovering, and a lot of
An
Atlantans in
interesting drive.
particular.
Did
So,
did I say this on the podcast last week or 2 weeks ago? I saw a 556 miles to Bucky's sign when I was driving in rural Wisconsin.
that checks out.
Yeah,
That's what they
uh-huh.
I
do.
don't even know where that could have been. Like, where would the nearest
Far,
Buc-ee's have been at that
That's
point?
very far. It could have been west, south, east, far.
I want them to put it at a billboard in Australia that just says like 4,000, 8,000 miles, wherever far it is to Bucky's.
That'd be pretty metal. I'm also kind of a fan of this idea now. It'd be a pretty good social media spot, I
Yeah,
gotta say.
yeah, yeah.
But that brings us to today's featured content, today's features segment. Jack, you had the idea for this segment a couple days ago when we were looking for something to give our give our listenership a real juicy piece of content for what's usually a pretty lean summer. But you recently read Dresser in White and Gold by Robert Wallace, which is basically the history of Georgia Tech from founding to
Late
um,
60s.
I thought it was to the centennial, right? Or it was released in honor of the centennial in 1985, but it goes to the 60s. Talk to me a little bit about what made you want to read the book. It sounds like
I
a very weird question,
No, I
but
get you. I get you. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say Jake was like, "You should read this." I'm like, actually, you're right. I should read this, considering
that's the reason
we.
I do many things.
I
So
mean, yeah. I mean, we do host the only weekly
Coercion.
podcast. We are the only
Woo.
weekly podcast that covers everything Georgia Tech under the sun as much as we reasonably can. Um, and so I was like, yeah, I know I should read this. There's a bunch of stuff I wanted to know. Just basically anything before I got to campus is just a big empty gap for me, and so that's a lot of years. Considering there's a lot of years before 2017 that tech existed, and I didn't have any family that went there, so it wasn't like I was growing up in this. Also, like a lot of people that on our staff were, or a lot of our friends were back in the day. Um, and right now, I have a job that at Georgia Tech right now that lended itself to knowing some history in particular. Basically, so I work for Rick Clark, who was the admissions director. If you've been admitted to Tech at all in the last 15 years up until this admission cycle, he is the one that has let you into Tech. Technically, he was the admissions director for a while there. He was the one that let all three of us into, or got admitted all of us into Tech. Um, and he has a new job called where he's the executive director for strategic student access, which effectively is finding pathways and means to get effectively students that would be on Pell Grants to come to Tech, because we have a we are last in the state of all the public schools in terms of getting in terms of our percentage of students, undergraduate student body being on Pell Grants, which means that we're not exactly doing well in helping economically disadvantaged folks that should be at Tech, who deserve to be at Tech, who have done the work to be at Tech. They're not getting to Tech, and a lot of that is because of the money. Um, and so a lot of just understanding just the history of Tech and how it's battled problems like this, or what the initial aims were, was all very interesting to me and Rick to try to recapture what the vision of Tech is, to kind of be a story of like, hey, these kids in a time where college is way too expensive. I think we can all agree with that. Even with Tech doing a great job of holding tuition down for a long time, there's still a lot of work to be done here. And so just knowing the history of Tech was going to be really helpful for that. And so that's what I did. That's part of why I read Dresser in White and Gold, was just kind of get the idea of like, where do we come from? What did we do? How have we made decisions in the past? How does transforming tomorrow, the current capital campaign and the thing that is driving Tech into our next era, how does that look compared to the many other versions we've had, where we had other capital campaigns that built campus out from Tech Tower and onward? So, and that's where Jake comes into play, because he kind of has all those answers too, and makes it good for podcasting.
Well, and that's where, before we start to like kind of hone in on some nitty-gritty points, because kind of peeling back the curtain, the way we want to frame this discussion isn't a Jake, Jack, and Akshay just tell you about something that happened 100 years ago. No, with Jack being involved with what he's doing right now, it's a great opportunity to take a look at the parallels between what we're seeing today versus back then. Obviously, very, very different on the high level, obviously this is an endowment isn't just a bank account that you can take money out of, but
No.
the school's a little bit different of a financial and programmatic, to say nothing of assets and liabilities and
Mhm.
student base to build off of reputation. All those things are wildly different, right? But the way we want to
You
frame
might say
this
100
is,
years has passed.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty big. But before we get into some of those nitty gritty points that I think we're gonna, really dive into, Jack, I want to ask, and of course, this is your first like cover to cover tech book, presumably, that
Yep.
you've read. There's not
It
that
is.
many of them out there,
Yeah.
but having read, well, all of them myself, can you tell, and I want your opinion on this, can you tell that Wallace is an alumnus when you read that book? Could you
Yeah.
tell?
Yeah. There was a lot of in the same vein of kind of how ArchSite works, where like we're very much a pro Georgia Tech place, where we like want to celebrate what we have done. We'll be honest when we need when things are not going well, but at the same time, it's
Yeah.
just like yes, we are definitely looking with a very hopeful lens of the future here,
Yeah.
and Wallace very much did that for the past as well. There was if there was nary a scandal to be talked about there, and I'm sure outside of Heisman, but then even that wasn't really a scandal when he got divorced. It was just a it happened kind of thing, at least of how he said it. So I'm sure there's a lot of other things that would color the stories more fully, but when it came to just how it got where tech went from how tech went from one spot to another does the job.
Well, and it's the we, our, us type framing, and shoot, we slip into that here on this podcast. We're
Oh
Georgia
yeah.
Tech fans and alumni as much as alumni employees. Like that's the kind of ownership that I feel like sports fans in general have, and
Yeah.
you hit the nail on the head. It's like I was read and of course Wallace. For those of you who don't know, Dress in White and Gold very much out of print. Lots of secondhand copies out there. So if you're so led, go check out Amazon. I've got two different editions at
You can
various
also
points. You
it is
you can
also
find it,
if you have
but
access to the tech library, there are digital
yes,
versions available that you can read.
yep. And all that to say, it was kind of like reading that same kind of content. And I use this to dovetail into, I used to be very regular when I was an undergrad student. I had a lot of time on my hands. Now 40-hour job, other commitments outside of work that keep me a little, I guess, more regularly busy than I was as a 19, 20-year-old kid. I think you can see that kind of, I guess, parallel in how I originally framed some of these events that we're about to talk about. I was reviewing old columns today, and there's a lot of that, just like Georgia Tech had this challenge. Of course, there's football and traditions and all that, other stuff that goes on. But Georgia Tech administration had this problem. It was bad. They conquered it using these tasks. But I think that really, and I don't want to say obscured. Obviously, there's only so many words you can do in a blog post to provide nuance. But Jack, when we were originally pitching this topic and kind of fleshing it out, dare I say, I was kind of lost as to what you were even like specifically honed in on. Is that a fair way to frame that?
Sure, I didn't pick that up, but okay.
Yeah, and I think that's because and Wallace, McMath, 100 years of history, all that stuff. We have a Georgia Tech to point to today, right? It's there. But if you kind of go back and read between the lines or read other sources, it paints a more, I guess, dire, a more dire financial situation for the Institute. And it's
Mhm.
really something that's kind of existed, really from the very beginning, or if not in the very beginning, they got it up and running and then state
Yep.
legislature kind of promptly forgot about it, or at
Yeah.
least to give it a little more money.
Basically, yeah. No, it seemed like over and over. I think what impressed me, impressed on me the most was that every time we wanted to make the school better, it seemed like no one that actually made the school happen in the first place cared to keep it going.
Yep.
It didn't necessarily feel like a trade off of just like they gave us something, they gave somebody something, and that tech, therefore tech existed. They're like, no, this seems like a good idea. Let's make tech exist. And then yeah, just didn't do anything with it. Like it took yeah, Rockefeller was a very important piece of this. French was a very important piece of this. And it was just wow
Carnegie
that
was a very important piece of
Carnegie
it
as
too.
well. Yeah,
Yeah, I
like
mean
over and
everywhere
over
you
again.
turn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
over and over again. Which I guess you'll get into more details here. Of just like, yeah, there is multiple. There, I just never realized how close 100 years ago and past and a little bit after, like how many times tech just almost didn't exist at
Well,
all.
and to frame that out, I see the turning point for the entire Georgia Tech story, beyond not just looking at the 1920s, but that definitive, decisive turning point I place in about 1947. Do either of you, actually, you might know this off the top of your head, do either of you know what significant thing happened post-war that clearly delineates two different eras of Georgia Tech?
GI Bill.
No, but kind of related. Kind of related. It's Georgia Tech specific.
Nope.
I'll give you another. If you went to the side of the DM Smith building, you would notice a really strange acronym. Why is that?
I would say I could, but that's currently under massive construction, so I can't. I
Ugh,
haven't looked at it recently.
you're killing me, guys. The
I'm
the
sorry.
name change. Georgia Tech, the
Oh,
Georgia
duh.
School of
Oh,
Technology versus the Georgia Institute of Technology. Of course, there's a lot at play in the Georgia School of Technology, right? That's a lot of evolution in that first, call it 70-ish years, 60, 70 years
Yeah.
that gets bottled up into that evolution. It's a very different school in 47 than it was in 1885. But
Hmm.
if you look at the Georgia Tech post GI Bill, if you look at Georgia Tech post World War II investments, if you look at Georgia Tech once it has like this critical mass of, oh yeah, they took away the commerce school, but we'll just call it management, like they figured some stuff out. And the
Right.
Georgia Tech, I think it's a more bureaucratic, it's bigger. There's, building this reputation. This Georgia Tech that exists post 1947, I think is fundamentally different than the one that kind of came before it. And of course, it's something that we could have 8 million podcasts on. We could talk about losing accreditation. We could talk about that commerce school piece. We could talk about the Great Depression. But really, I think Matheson's decision, Kenneth Matheson, there's a dorm named after him on campus. He was an English professor that got promoted to president. I think his decision to leave Georgia Tech for the Drexel Institute of Technology in Philly is emblematic of that struggle. And to kind
Yeah.
of frame it a little bit more, Matheson was the president, World War One. A lot of resources do go into Georgia Tech as an engineering school, as a place to train soldiers, some reacclimation once they get back, kind of the proto GI Bill, if you will. But if you look at the like recurring every other paragraph. Oh, at the end of the year, Matheson had to go beg the state legislature for more money. Matheson had to do XYZ to get Rockefeller to sign on to build the YMCA. This,
Hmm.
that, there was no library. He had to go, get Carnegie to go build him a library. I can't remember where I found this quote. I may have just made it up as myself being anonymous. Find you somebody who loves Matheson, who loves you the way Matheson loved his library. Like that was the struggle, right? They couldn't get these essential building blocks of funding an institution.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the whole math scenario was fascinating with just how much of tech didn't exist before he was
Mhm.
president, and then how much of it that we still use now
Yep.
existed after he was done. And I mean, I get walking away too. Like with how much he added, I'm just like, yeah, take a much more relaxing job at a place where colleges are extremely well respected and universities
Yeah.
much more respected. It's just the general Northeast,
Hmm.
especially back then. Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, beyond kind of the opposite of what we were talking about, like the points were technically went extinct, but yeah, Matheson throwing so much life into tech was is a fact. I'd go if y'all can, if people listening, like, I definitely go back and just look at what Matheson did. Like a lot of what you know about tech or know of tech in terms of the physical footprint is completely due to him. Um,
Oh yeah. I mean, Britain has a reputation as a builder. Of course, there's the urban renewal as the 1960s roll in, but
Mhm.
so much of that old campus of Georgia Tech is a Matheson product. And there's one piece in his departure, Jack, that I want to hone in on. And,
Okay.
and this is, did you notice the part where they mentioned that he came back from Europe and was going through fainting spells?
Remember him going through the fanning spells? Yeah.
That struck me the first time I read it, and it struck me today and yesterday in rereading notes and things like that. That sounds an awful lot like what happened to Lyman Hall, who was his predecessor.
Yes.
It
Yes.
is these men that are being put through essentially a shoestring budget process, having to go beg for money, and it killed one of them.
Yeah. Well, again,
That's the lore.
go
That's
to
the lore, at least.
yeah, go into a couple of specifics here. What are those a couple examples for Hall and Matheson where it's just like this thing just drove them so far up a wall that it got them to either it was causing legitimate health effects for their
Yeah,
personal life.
yeah. I mean, we've talked about some of those philanthropists, and there are great things that philanthropy has given Georgia Tech, and there's great things that it still gives to Georgia Tech today. But even going in front of the state legislator, and this is to bring it all the way back to Lyman Hall. We're talking back into the 1890s, which feels like forever ago to us. But also keep in mind these legislators, like they were there or
Mhm.
around when tech was invented. This is a hey, we invented this place. We have to keep it funded. But even in those days, specifically 1897, Hall gets sent out, go to the state legislature. They finally agreed to give him some money, but there's
Mhm.
always a catch when he does get that money. And in this specific one, it was essentially a funding match, right? You had
Yeah.
to raise 10 to get 10. You had to raise X to get X. And that's a valid way that, people structure philanthropy and raising money today. But it's also at the same time, it's not really a way that, is conducive for a chronically underfunded public school to continue to provide public education at a reasonable cost to its attendees.
Yeah. And let's keep in mind, Tech was not charging tuition then. Like it was everything came from the state or whatever they could fundraise. There was no
Mhm.
students giving money. Like this was meant to be a public good for students that wanted to learn the engineering trade. Um,
Yep.
and which is a line that Rick has kind of my boss has stolen for fundraising from other folks now for
Wait, wait, wait,
scholarships that we want to
wait, wait.
develop.
Wait, what are you telling me? Public education? A public good
You'd
for
never believe it.
free
You'd never
in
believe it,
Well,
this economy?
hey, as
especially
as
this
the resident
economy.
out of state guy, I do have to chime in. That was free to in-state students. There
It
was
was.
out-of-state tuition, but they weren't paying in-state taxes. Like it
No, they
makes
were. Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
If you want
Yeah.
to come from North Carolina or Illinois or New York, you've always had to pay to go to
Yeah,
church.
it was mostly pretty fair in that regard of
Yeah.
how the money got allocated, where it came from to fund these students. But yeah, like I think it's a
Oh,
reason
and
why it's a lot easier to keep the school. Well, obviously it's not a problem to keep the school afloat now, but the whole revenue stream just wasn't tapped for decades.
and I do want to point out there's a critical word I think we missed when we talked about didn't charge in-state tuition. They couldn't. They were
Yes,
not allowed
it was in the
to
state
charge for
code. Yeah, it
tuition.
was in the state code. Yeah,
Yeah. Which is such an important piece of nuance. Because if you're allowed, you go, okay, well, I guess we have to do a little bit. We have to keep the doors open. But it's literally tying the hand behind the back to say, like, oh yeah, we're not going to give you enough money to maintain your buildings, let alone build new ones, let alone
yeah,
accommodate more kids in dormitories, things like that. Oh, we're also not going to let you charge for things that aren't, a special fee,
right.
which is just wild.
Do you have on the top of your head which projects require the state was like, hey, we have this money for you, but it's going to take you to some fundraising to get this done before we show our money?
Yeah, I mean that was a pretty classic move for them. It was an almost annual affair, especially in the Lyman Hall days and things like that. But the problem with being a prolific builder is, hey, okay, raise 10,000 and we'll get back to you. Is you send these precedents out and in one specific case, we're talking about, the A French building we talked about. Some of this was equipment, so it's also going to people to get old product from them. But
Mhm.
going out and then raising $35,000 in cash and equivalents when you're only tasked to raise 10, it's almost like they were too effective, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Is that a fair take? Like it's like oh, you didn't even need that 10,000 in the first place. You got way more from everyone else,
Yeah,
you
I'm
know?
sure the state loved that. But
Yeah.
it also still you're still operating on razor thin margins though at the same time, which is where I think there's a lot of disconnect with what
Yeah.
tech was internally doing for a lot of time was I mean operating obviously never died, but again what I want to get to is getting you to explaining how it almost died at 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 various points, which is like the state was happy to not give money if they could avoid giving money, uh,
Yeah.
but tech was so good at what it was doing that it gave off the impression that it didn't need the money also because our leadership was so stinking effective at being leaders for so long and kind of setting that precedent for what is still true about the school today.
Well, yeah, and I think this is where we frame it with the kind of well, when I originally wrote the article, we were talking about the campaign for Georgia Tech, which raised 1.8 billion. But now we're on to transforming tomorrow because there's always another one in the pipeline. And you look at World War One as almost causing tech to be a victim of its own success, right? You have a Georgia Tech that is a lot, frankly, bigger than it was, right? It is saying, hey, tech, you have all these students to support, but you have the same amount of essentially or similar amount of state legislature money coming in. Okay, maybe we'll let you start charging in-state tuition, but there is no way to accommodate an it. Well, of course, it did, but it's very challenging to accommodate that simultaneously influx of students. Uh, that there is some of that
Mm-hmm.
post-war bump from the federal government, but not nearly what we saw with the GI Bill. And you have deferred maintenance and buildings that already exist that need to be maintained in there. And that's where it's bad, right? Because you are
Mm-hmm.
almost a self-defeating cycle of you're too big, too fast, with not enough money to do the things you need to do or the things that you need to do in order to grow. Is that a fair way to frame that?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And the way I kind of want to bring this back around is again back to that 1947 Georgia School of Technology. You saw a fundamentally different attitude by the federal government post New Deal, which is, again, we could talk about the Great Depression. That was not very kind to Georgia Tech either. But you saw a different attitude post New Deal, post World War II, in which the federal government was more involved in education than it had been at the same point in World War One, when we saw on a smaller, not micro, but just smaller scale, a lot of the same effects, having to have new programs, signal cores, new engineering facilities, things like that. And there wasn't nearly the same reaction. And that's because you had a big influx of cash to kind of smooth all of that over. And again, that's to say nothing of the effects of the Great Depression, losing the Commerce School, all that in the 30s, which kind of are a microcosm of similar problems with the legislature, but I would say different because it's not quite the same top dollar sign amount, even though the results were kind of the same dire straits.
yeah, yeah. And there was, I mean, what with the Commerce School, that was a that was a long battle to convince the state. Yeah, the engineering school should have the business school when we have a school in Athens that's definitely more fitted at the time to host the Commerce School because it has the everything else going on in terms of the public colleging that existed in the U.S. or in the state at the
Oh
time.
my God, don't get me
Well,
on this because I'll
well,
do both the commerce school thing and the fact that that same university up the street or up the interstate now has an engineering program and will have a medical school. If I get started on this, I will never stop. I will
well,
cease. I will just spontaneously combust into flame in this chair. Oh
The
my God.
College of Management was called the College of Management until 2012. That was not long ago.
No, not
Like,
at all.
The
like
M
we
train, my
live with these
guy.
effects.
I
We
mean,
live with these effects today.
they never got rid
Like,
of the MGT like shorthand for what the business degree. Like you are in MGT 2042 or whatever your classes are. It is not BUS or anything like that. You are still a management degree at Tech even now. They call it the Schiller College of Business, but like you're getting a management degree still.
That's like naming rights, though. That's like stadium naming rights. It's like being
well,
called the Bobby Dodd Stadium at Hyundai Field.
well, and
It's a facade. It's a veneer.
we live with these legacies even today. Like Georgia Tech,
Yeah.
you hear the name Georgia Institute of Technology and you think Caltech, MIT. Those are how private engineering, Drexel Institute of Technology, Armor Institute of Technology. That's how private, engineering specific schools are often styled. Public, large state-sponsored universities are usually styled as an A&M, right? I mean, Clemson's kind of an exception, Purdue's kind of a, in a similar Clemson-y boat. But you get the A&Ms, of various stripes. You have Polytechs, Alabama Polytech or Auburn, Virginia Polytech. Those are the difference there, and you see that legacy in Georgia Tech not having an ag school, even though it might make a lot of sense. That was kind of the same kind of industrial extraction based economy. Those
Mm-hmm.
industrialists who originally founded Georgia Tech, like that was what they were going for when they set up Georgia Tech. It was a bunch of textile guys. Voila, never materialized, if you
Mm-hmm.
will, down here. We live with that on a programmatic basis. We live with that on just where and how things are built on campus and when they got built on campus. It's, a legacy of the Olympics that caught tech up in so many ways. And again, Georgia Tech is, and Jack, maybe this is where we're zooming back out again. Georgia Tech is not like its quote unquote peers, or even the peers that I guess we were measuring ourselves against 10 years ago in that regard. I mean, this is your day to day, so you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but it it's almost like a stagger step to account for all of these tiny little problems 100 years ago of being underfunded in some way or not having this program. Shoot, not having a student center until 1960. Great example of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like that these are tiny little things that have coalesced into an institute that we all love now, but one that is, I would say, fundamentally different in a lot of ways than its peers in funding and legacy ways, but also in some really, I would say, positive ways too. But that's another different podcast.
But you raise
Yeah.
a good point, right? It's when we compare tech to its peers, it's both the MITs, the Caltechs on like the hard engineering side, but it's also, if we want to take like a half athletic tack to it, it's like the Stanfords, the Notre Dames, the I don't know what's the other school,
Well, I'll
the
tell you.
Michigans, right?
I'll tell you. The Tech
The
has a list of peer institutions they have self-published,
Yes.
and it
well, there
includes.
we go. I don't have to make them up off the fly.
And you both are right. Like it is MIT, it is Carnegie Mellon, it is Caltech, it is Cornell, it is Stanford, but it is also and Purdue. It is also Penn State, Texas A&M, conference rival Cal Berkeley,
Yeah.
UCLA, Illinois, Michigan, UT Austin, Washington, and UW Madison. Like it is the biggest, most generalized state schools and also the hyper focused engineering schools. Like we are trying, like in a way, we are trying to do everything all at once without the med school
Yes. Yes. Without the med
and
school. And
and
that's where you
and a law
see
school.
Georgia Tech exists in this very strange, not strange, but this very unique space that's almost a go-between in a lot of different ways because it's been forced to evolve in certain
Yeah,
ways. And that's a legacy of where we're at now. And again, some of those really positive. Hope and Zell are great additions, but Jack, your job is making it, so those
on top.
talented
Yep.
in-state kids and other kids can get to Georgia Tech. I mean, that's fundamentally different than a private school or even
Yeah.
some other state schools and stuff like that. So,
Shall we ad break?
Yes,
sure.
we shall. You know what? I don't really know where we are in this narrative. We've gone all over the place.
I don't know
So
where we are either.
Well, and that's the thing about having great Georgia Tech apparel on is I've been comfortable the entire time we've been wildly swinging across the dial of Georgia Tech history. Because at the end of the day, what I want to do and what I aim to do here is a lot like what Stephen is doing in providing high quality Georgia Tech apparel. I want to provide high quality, on point with the times Georgia Tech content. Speaking of that high quality apparel, you can find it at section103.com, at Section 103 on Twitter as well. But Section 103 is the best place to get current, but also vintage, historical, inspired, unique Georgia Tech related designs. Of course, one that comes to mind is the Juniors Grill shirt. I'm often wearing that when we do this here fine podcast, but also plenty of others just like it, in addition to football specific, basketball specific, historical and historical-esque shirts as well on theme for our podcast today. As always, use code FTRS for 10% off. You can get free shipping on orders over $70. Gents, back to you. And I lead with, where do we go from here with this topic? We've been everywhere. We've been a lot of different places. And, that's
Yeah,
my
so
fault. But
just a peek behind the curtain here. In our document, we have like a fairly structured, like chronological timeline. And as these two have been talking, I keep looking back to the timeline and hearing what they're listening to. And I'm like, where? Like, I like timelines, I like logic, but these guys have crisscrossed the map.
We
So
did
let's
we did Matheson and Hall simultaneously,
well, and we
basically.
I'd say we talked about Lyman Hall more than I kind of intended to go into this with, but I mean, he's a
Well,
great case study for
so,
exactly what we were talking about.
do we need to do more Matheson before we move on to the
well,
world
let
wars?
me level set. Let
Okay,
me
okay,
draw
okay.
some lines here across the rapid squiggles that we've drawn just now. So we talked about President Lyman Hall and how he basically worked himself to death trying to fundraise for this nascent uh, technological school, effectively vocational school at the time, right?
Yeah,
Engineering vocational school. You have the expansion of the School of Technology under Matheson in so many ways. And then you have the First World War. And like Jake, you were saying, the mini bump due to the GI Bill, but not with the same amount of verve and fervor from the feds that the actual GI Bill would bring later on down the road after a second Great War, right? So you have this nascent, still effectively nascent school, right? We're talking about barely 30 years of history that
yeah.
has now gained new army and military focused programs, and I think the ROTC program comes into fruition at this point as well. But it comes along without a requisite amount of funding to have all of these programs and support all of them, and then also, like you said, renovate existing buildings and expand and do live out its life as a actual university, as an actual educational platform. And so you have just this lack of funding results in what can only be attributed to or only be called a brain drain effect, right? And I think that's where we should start the second half of this as we come out of World War One, as we have to deal with the structural effects of now having that influx of students, but not charging tuition and having no way to actually house, treat,
Right.
invest, et cetera, all the things that you expect from a proper university in the year of our collective religious bodies, 2024. Like, what does that period, that late tens, early 20s, heading into the Depression, what does that period look like for the Georgia School of Technology at that point?
Well, we talked about Matheson. We talked about him coming back 1919 after the war. We did talk about him leaving for Drexel, so I won't beat around the bush there. It did come with a pay increase, but at the end of the day, the major players were the General Education Board and the Rotary Club of Atlanta. The reason I say those and not some person is because it was a grant from that General Education Board and a loan from the Rotary Club. that
Oh
implying that
boy,
it
how much
has
I
to
love
be paid
loans.
back. Yeah, that kept the doors open. That was the difference between staying open and closing. Quite frankly, it was a loan from the Rotary Club, and that's where you start to get into this weird miasma of an institute that's trying to find its way still, I would say, where you don't have, and this is something, oh gosh, every podcast is someone's first, but this is something that people talk about when they talk about Florida State football circa, 20 years ago, is you don't have that large of at the time, a living alumni base. And this was true of Georgia Tech in the teens and 20s. The people who had gone to Georgia Tech, gotten out, are in their what, mostly 30s, 40s, 50s. You're not at the point where you're doing major philanthropy. And quite frankly, this is another parallel that we can make to today. Jack, do you have the exact percentage off the top of your head? It's a staggeringly large percentage of living Georgia Tech alumni that are under the age of like 30 or 35. Isn't
Oh,
it like
I
a
don't have the
majority or close to
I
it?
don't have an exact, but yeah, it's at least like 30-40% because the student body just in the like we are targeting right now 4,000 new freshmen every fall.
Yeah.
Not even 10 years ago it was under 3,000. So
Oh
Right.
it
yeah.
And
just it
10
even
years
it
ago is when I started.
and
So
10
let's
years before
let's
that
be
it was
clear.
even smaller too. So like it's just
Mhm.
been they've been J curving. It's going to flatten out, but like it's been J curving how many new applicants each year show up to campus.
And to tie
Yep.
that back too, it's like some of the same challenges with regards to like feeding and housing
Mhm.
and satisfying the needs of that same growing student body. Like we're seeing that in 2024, we're seeing those same challenges
A
arise
lot of them.
in
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
far
Yep.
different environment, but they're the same ones as 1919 or 1924, right? Like given there's been 100 years of history, but it's SSDD, right? Same stuff, different day.
Yep. Well, and that's the thing, kind of where I was trying to go with that is that gap, the state legislature, that in-state tuition that living alumni couldn't fill back then, was filled largely by local businessmen. As tech kind of hones in and has more of that gap there, or the critical mass in Atlanta, if you will. The Rotary Club is essentially an organization of businessmen, right? And individual local establishments are what kept tech functioning. There's a reason why a lot of the era specific things you'll see, what comes to mind as local Atlanta type operations. Grant Field, local developer. Peters Park, local interest there, to say nothing of Inman's, Emerson's. I think there's probably some other that should come to the top of the head pretty rapidly, but alas. Yeah, I think the parallels are there. Obviously, of course, as we've said, like four ways to Sunday, six ways to Sunday, whatever you want to go with there for your idiom of choice. It's obviously a very different landscape on the whole, but at the end of the day, if you're growing fast, you need resources. And if that's not the one thing that everyone would love to have more of, I don't know what is. So probably not the most useful point there, but
I don't know about
that's
you. I asked my landlord to raise my rent so I could just grind harder, you know?
oh, congrats. Well, and so this was the fact that I had pulled something up on the side here and circled back around, and I was trying to verify. But at least for the point where a couple of my major sources had been written, Wallace comes to mind. I'm not sure if it was true for McMath as well, but it was certainly true for Britton. The story of Georgia Tech, Marion Britton, the guy who the dining hall is named after, former president, wrote when he retired, A History of Georgia Tech. Wallace is the book that came after that, and McMath was written for the 100th anniversary, Engineering New South, for Georgia Tech in 1985. But for a decent chunk of those years, there were endowments even that people left for Georgia Tech that they couldn't touch, that were so locked up, even though, Julius Brown had given a bunch of money. This is a great example to Georgia Tech. They couldn't tap into any of that money because it was endowed for specific things or specific programs that they wanted to add. So even though there was this money to be a Julius Brown chair or a Julius Brown professor, that they couldn't even do that with the resources they did have. And of course,
Yep.
not everyone can be a I guess well-off former governor type of person, but if we were all so lucky to give Georgia Tech lots and lots of money that they couldn't even use, it's a great problem to have, but it doesn't do you any good when you're Matheson or Britton and you have all the or Van Leer even, where
Yep.
we were trying to make something happen, but you can't even have a Brown professor of chemistry or a Brown professor of computers engineering because you can't tap into that specific resource.
It's a I think it's a frustrating part of even for like little minute problems that I was trying to solve when I was at the technique and things like that. Of just like, okay, I know there's money for this somewhere, but getting to it is so freaking hard.
Yep.
For seemingly ridiculous reasons when you're in the swell of it all and like in the heat of the moment, but like people have their reasons. I don't know. Um, but yeah, I think it's startling as a whole. A lot of what I can say is about a much more higher level than what you can go into in terms of specifics, but that continuing push of just like knowing there is money there available to tech because people want to give money to tech. Like even through all this outside of the state of Georgia and the early part of the school's history, like people were actively trying to keep this place afloat. And the fact that the business leaders I think saw that it was worth keeping afloat is a big notable deal as well. Um, and has been helpful even now as well. And I really wonder down the line. This is looking too far ahead, so we can let listeners make a note. We're going backwards in time. But in the future, when we have this large body of alumni that are coming through the ranks now, that are getting older and getting higher paying jobs as they develop through their careers, like you could see a world where this is much less of it's much less of a problem now than it was in this time that we're talking about in the World War years. But like the idea of like, ah, crap, we're still having to like fight the state to like build the ISYE building and to figure out how we're going to develop North Ave and where like just so many little things still are so hard for us to figure out. We're not and to get money for scholarships, which is my job now and Rick's job now. So many of those little not hurtful issues, but just major roadblocks to pushing tech in the future. Tech still pushed itself into the future despite all that. But that theme that we're covering here of like the money wasn't there as much as we needed it to be, we are maybe going to hit escape velocity out of that just purely because of how many alumni we're going to have in the near future that we never had before in school's history. Living alumni, I should say.
Akshay, go.
Yeah, so there are two things that came to mind actually during that. I think they're kind of related, but
I think I can
when
guess
you're
one.
talking about the investment of the business community, right? I think Jake, you and I have talked about this, and maybe we put this in engineering and program too. But when you that investment is not just monetary; it's like social class related too, right?
Yep.
You could see, I think what you could see in the city of Atlanta before the rise of pro sports is that tech was the hottest social ticket in town, right? Like those
Yep, it
Georgia
was.
Tech football games were events unto themselves. And I'm not just saying that with gold colored glasses. That's basically how they're described in the literature writ large, right? Like there's a class element there and there's a prestige element there that comes along with that. And obviously, I think the intervening 60, 70 years, the athletic turmoil and however you want to describe that the last period has changed the dynamics of that. But one of the things that branches off that, and the second thing I wanted to mention, especially as you talk about how tech wants to fit in better with the rest of the city, like developing the North Ave corridor, and also a lot of these project investments that it's making alongside the city of Atlanta today. I think earlier today, news came out about a city of Atlanta raise grant from the federal government that was going to improve bike and walkway connectivity amongst the west side of Atlanta and Tech's path, part of the path system. and Tech's walkways and the Beltline. So that investment of the school back into the city is relatively a new thing too, right? Like Tech we used to be seen as that social class, that like a level of social class, a level of prestige. And then it got all of this land in urban renewal, and then the athletics program, yada, 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 intervening 40, 50, 60 years. And then you get to the 90s, you get to the Olympics, and Jake, you made this point earlier, Tech catching back up with the institutions that it decided was its peers at the time, with the investment of the Atlanta Olympic Committee for the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, excuse me. And also the expansion, obviously, after the change to the Georgia Institute of Technology, but then also getting tighter and tighter with the business interests in the city of Atlanta after that Olympic period and the civic powers that be, those interests, and building those relationships with projects like Tech Square and the Beltline and I don't know, like each of these individual kind of small scale projects to really break down that barrier between this very strong technology school that exists in the middle of a major American city that's divided from the city on all four sides by
Yeah. Yeah.
a U.S. highway, a major arterial connection, a massive interstate, the value of which we talked about earlier, in which we wanted to sink it under a bunch of water, and then another major arterial road on the other side. Like
And
they
railroad
have
tracks to
been,
top it off.
they've been like Tech has invested. I forgot exactly where I was going with this, so bear with me while I try to find my point back. But Tech, like those business interests, are what is helping Tech to an extent, helping Tech grow back today. Those business interests, but now Tech is investing back. Like it's both ways now,
It's able to
right?
reach out. It's
Like,
able to reach out in ways that it hasn't been able to in the past in a lot of ways, but it also understands, I think, much better now, especially under Cabrera, how much of a again, social to use the word social good again, but like how much of how important being a good neighbor to the rest of Atlanta is and how important that is to helping them thrive and helping its students thrive as well.
and I think to that point too, and we're kind of getting far afield of these drought years, and maybe the next comment should be bringing it back. But like some of the projects that are in flight, right? Connecting, like building a bridge, both literal and figurative, between Science Square
Yep.
and the rest of campus, and then investing in the west side of Atlanta
Yep.
that was basically overrun by urban renewal, which Tech at the time took full advantage of, right? In the way that it expanded westward into that part of the city.
Mm.
And so I think that's kind of the difference in this era of Tech compared to that era that we're talking about is that in that era in the 20s you see a lot, like you said, it's investment from these businessmen because they see the opportunity and like power or future potential of having a technology school in a major American city or a growing American city. And now it's about obviously business interests investing in a major American university, but also using that power to make better relationship with those businesses and also local businesses, and then also the community ring around the institution,
Mm-hmm.
right? So interesting. There are parallels, but there's also perpendicular lines. You know,
You know, the funny thing is, I thought one of your points was going to be noting that a lot of the growth and a huge chunk of Georgia Tech's current student base is fully online, and a lot of young alumni, such as myself and Jack, had a couple years even as fully, on-campus students lost to the COVID pandemic era. So that point in my brain that I was going to be prepared to respond to is completely out the window. But on the notion of bringing it all the way back around, I think the fact that and kind of zooming back out is just kind of contemplating how we remember folks at Georgia Tech, remembering Matheson. Maybe I'm the only guy who does that, but at least everyone who walks into Britton Dining Hall has to think about what ML or Marion, if you will, Marion L. Britton did for Georgia
Well, his
Tech,
name
even
is
if
on
they,
a, to be
yeah,
clear, his name is on
yeah,
on a dorm that may or may not exist if they cap the connector, but that's besides the point. But
beside the point, beside the point. But all that I'm saying is it's something I've been reflecting on, and again, trying to bring this back is with the recent passing of Homer Rice, which Jack, again, you handled excellently, and I really appreciated your and Ken's chat, is it seems like a way that we, as Georgia Tech folks, are inclined to do our remembering, whether that's Heisman, Bobby Dodd, Homer Rice, Matheson, Britton, Isaac Hopkins comes to mind, Lyman Hall, is through buildings and just remembering the guy. And I think reading back on some of my old, articles, it's really framed in this like Matheson had this problem, Hall had this problem, and it was bad, and they solved it. And at the end of the day, they did solve it. That's why we have a Georgia Tech, right?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily conventional ways to solve it. They're not ways that, say, folks from Athens necessarily had to solve problems in the same way, just
they
given
don't really
the
solve problems, though.
the funding difference there and how all that kind of politics plays out. But I think at the end of the day, it's important to frame it as tons of very little things had to happen in order for Georgia Tech to continue to exist. Talking about grants and loans and tuitions and legislature funding and federal funding and all of these things together and new programs and higher arching national things. That's why Georgia Tech survived in a place where time was tough. It's not necessarily today that Georgia Tech is going to stop existing. It is huge. It's massive. It brings in all these grants and revenue and has these endowments that are invested in these stable funds. It's a different problem. But at the same time, it is a collection of very small things that has to happen in order for Georgia Tech to continue to be the unique space. I think we've used this episode to establish, and this whole site exists because we think Georgia Tech is a unique space worth celebrating. But there's a lot of very little things that need to change, evolve, grow, whatever word you want to put in there. Akshay, you did a good job of bringing it to the macro Atlanta level. Like that all needs to happen in order to have another successful 100 years. If you want Georgia Tech to fulfill its mission of being an accessible public education, that's able to be, accessed by the many and also provide that good value, that proposition that I think, especially for me as an out-of-state person who had to, come down here, like that's a big thing that drew me to be a part of it, was that unique kind of lens that it provides. Is that kind of a fair way to kind of start bringing us home with this podcast?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, yeah, a lot of the work now is on campus is not only like setting itself up for the future, but also to make sure it can stay at that value for folks to make sure it can be accessible for Georgia, because it is the Georgia Institute of Technology. Yes, we have out of states. Yes, we have international folks that come in, and that's a very important part of the student body and people that get involved. It doesn't not supposed to just be just for Atlanta or just for the suburbs. Like it's meant to be for it meant to be for a public good. As I give now the third time I've used that. Um, yeah, I think that's where a lot of the work's going. The problems are different, as you said, but the access and I think actually also the business side of it. Like we hear one of the biggest economic drivers in the state too. Like a lot of the state relies on tech now being great and doing the work that it does and churning out the talent that it does and educating the people that it does educate. Um, and pretty much every time we have tried to do something new, we're pretty successful at it too. And yeah, it has part of that has come from just little things that have kept us afloat or that have been like, oh, okay, we have this thing, so we'll do this because that's just what's available to us and things like that. A lot of the Science Square and Art Square things are going to be in that same vein. Like,
Oh, I forgot
yes.
about Art Square.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
that
yeah.
that's a deep recess of our episode of the master plan that's stuck in my brain that I
Yeah,
didn't realize that I had in me.
yeah.
I'm gonna
Well,
have to go back to that one.
and I think the public good is a great place to leave or not leave it, but a great place to highlight as we kind of again wrap it all up is Georgia Tech was seemed almost like a public nuisance. If you want to frame all of what we just said about those first 20, 30, 40 years of Georgia Tech, it's like it was, oh, here's some money, now leave us alone for a while. Oh, here's some
Yeah.
more money, leave us alone for a while. But when you see Georgia Tech as a public good, and again, whether that's getting in-state students in the door in the first place or
Mhm.
getting heck talented international and out-of-state students to come and then stay at Georgia Tech,
Yep.
like the I don't know. We all still live nearby. I think we're comfortable in saying like we are
Yeah.
invested in at least, seeing this through, and we're products of that education, Georgia Tech education, I should say. That's why it's there is to be that, I guess, that kind of
Yeah.
uh not everyone stays, not everyone's from here. It's the same side or the different side of the same coin.
Yeah. And I think we're trying to get ahead of the curve on this diving board to like education statistics, but a lot of those really exclusive schools or like high level schools, like they're not growing with the demand that they have. Like their physical
Yeah.
supply is not matching that, and we understand that is a problem. That is why our student classes have expanded for freshman applicants every year, and why it's gonna probably one day hit 5,000 at some point. That's why the online CS Masters exists. Like we don't want Georgia Tech does not want Georgia Tech just to be, and why we're doing work and why we're trying to make sure we can be socioeconomically equitable for anyone that wants to show up. Like we don't want Georgia Tech to just be for a certain group of people that happen to be in Georgia that can afford it. Like
Yep.
that is the mission now. That is the work. Um
Yep.
I,
and
I
yeah.
think something that we've like to that point, I think something that we've said, and yes, I know I'm going back to like a period that we're not supposed to be talking about in this, but something that we said talking about the 50s to the 90s and characterizing that period is that tech sort of existed in its own ivory tower, barred on all sides by major arterial roads,
Mhm.
right? And didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to invest in the community. Um, and I, personality wise, very much so have a problem with something that sort of acts that way, right? Like, I don't like arrogant things. And so to hear that well, one, experience the educational product, so to speak, that Georgia Tech is providing, and then also be able to be objective at a level and look back and say, okay, and also hear from you, someone that's in the know about those current programs, that tech is breaking down that ivory tower and turning it into more less of a tower and more of a bridge, right, or a
Yep.
collection
Yep.
of bridges, um, and investing in all of these ways to lower the barrier to entry of getting a Georgia Tech degree. I think that is a very good thing. Like obviously, like I find it so satisfying and fulfilling, right? I'm not doing any of
Yeah.
the work, but I find it like
Right. Right.
it's the
No,
right thing to do.
I get your point.
Um,
There are so many people that are able to, like, I mean, yeah, obviously tech is still hard. Like, not it's not for
yeah, I mean,
everybody.
like
It is not for
let's be
everybody,
clear,
but there is a
like
lot of people that are applying to tech that if they may not get in, but if they got in, would be awesome. There are thousands of kids, and that applies for every other school that it's in our league right now. They would be great, and not everyone can get everywhere because there is still a supply issue. And that's what we're trying to address. And I think what we wanted to highlight here is like, hey, there was a problem of even surviving, and now we've come this far into like now it's a we are thriving so much we can't even keep up. Um, which
but to that point, it's like the environments are different, and maybe this is the note to end on, right? The environments are different, the lived experiences are different,
yes,
but I think as we said earlier, some of the problems are the exact same, right? You're expanding. Well, you might have the funds now, but like how and
yeah,
how you structure those expansions and what steps you take to satisfy the needs of your growing and wanting to grow student body.
mhm,
Those are challenges that tech solved and survived in some ways as a nascent program and now has to solve and expand as a thriving academic program,
Yep.
right? But and the environments are different, but the problems are still the same. And I think that's an like very interesting, I mean, higher education parallel, but that's an interesting
Yeah.
parallel
Yep.
over the course of 100 years of history of that. Like to borrow a line from like a famous video game series, war never changes, right? It's the environments get different, but war never changes.
Right.
You're
Right.
still
Yeah.
fighting an uphill battle versus all these parties. So I think this has been a really good discussion, gents. We eventually found our way. We came into this spending we saying we didn't want to spend an hour and 45 minutes on the horn, and we have spent an hour and 40. So
Guys, there is a
great
whole nother
job.
section of this outline we chopped up because we knew if we did it, we were gonna hit the 2 hour
Well,
mark. So I'm so glad we thought of this ahead of
it
time.
would have been the Javi Baez home run swing, or I guess every swing of podcasts, in that you're trying to hit a 5 run home run. Too much content. Not going to happen. You got to keep stuff a little locked in, you know?
Stay in your lane. Yep.
Yeah.
You get it has to not be like those first two episodes of the podcast we ever did
Those 4 hours.
when the four of us were sick, tired, and sunburnt, sitting in a hotel room in Tampa, Florida after the USF Tech game in which Tech got two kickoff return touchdowns against it. And we spoke for at least 2.5 hours, and I had to cut it like three times. It was great.
You say the 5 run home run. That sounds like something the Savannah Bananas should innovate. Find out how to do the 5 run home run.
I once saw a Harlem Globetrotters game and they had a 4 point circle. That's the kind of energy I'm
Yeah,
getting from
there
that.
should be a 5 run homer spot. All right, are we doing trivia or are we not doing trivia today?
We're
We
doing
can.
trivia.
It
All right,
timed out. We talked so long, so you're gonna have to stall for like 30 more seconds for me to get it back up. But
No, no, no. We'll lead with trivia the next time because I think that'll be a
okay.
great intro to our next topic, which is basically going to be the next 20 years of history
yeah.
after the 1920s, and talking about the Depression and the war and the GI Bill. I mean, it's going to be the U.S. is having its summer of soccer this summer. This is going to be the summer of history for tech podcasts. I'm sure of it.
Well, this is why we keep the lights on, or how we keep the lights on over the summer, if I do say so.
Much like how tech kept the lights on in the 1920s by looking for
Oh,
content and looking for ways to fund. This is our
look what he
content
did
for
there.
you all.
I'm shocked. You made a good tie back. Good job.
You're so shocked that you are going to lead us out for tonight.
Yes, as always, thanks for bearing with us. I know it's a long episode, but we got a couple more of these this summer before things start to spool back up again. So if there's things you want to hear about, let us know. You can let us know at fromtherumbleseat@gmail.com. You can find us at fromtherumbleseat.com. Leave a comment, of course, and on your podcast, rate and review and like and subscribe and all that. We appreciate that there too. But if you want to contact us directly, the website, comments, and the email are a great way to do it. You can also find us on Twitter at FTRS Blog. I'm at Jake Grant 98. Jack is at Jack Nicholas. You can find Section 103 there as well at Section 103 and Section103.com. Facebook, Instagram, YouTube at From the Rumble Seat, and you can find us wherever fine podcasts are otherwise distributed. Good night. Good luck. We'll see you soon. Go Jackets.